Tonight, I'm going to talk about Lincoln and 5 critical decisions he made, and sort of look with you, ultimately, as we have the discussion afterward, about some of the threads that really make Lincoln the great threads of leadership that make Lincoln the great president that he was. More books have been written about Lincoln than any other American. He is endlessly fascinating because he was a remarkable combination of straightforward and complex. Much of what he said has several levels of meaning and must be plumbed to be understood. But he was also always honest, and that's a thread that I'll touch on tonight several times. He was a wily politician, but he had a personal compass informed by morals, logic, and facts that guided his decisions and ultimate objectives. His deep personal integrity and intellectual honesty earned him the revered place in history he occupies. As we discuss tonight's 5 key decisions, the common threads that tell us about Lincoln's decision-making processes, intellect, judgment, and a reasoned understanding of the relationship of facts to the ultimate objective become clear as we move through his presidency. I want to talk first about assembling the cabinet. This is lifted heavily from Doris Kearns Goodwin's book. When Lincoln was elected president with only a plurality of the vote, he was widely dismissed by the political class as an uncouth hick. Lincoln knew differently. He had faith in himself and in his own intellect. He also recognized the challenges coming his way, as he made clear in his beautiful farewell address as he left Springfield to assume the presidency in March of 1861. To be elected, Lincoln first had vanquished 3 very able Republican opponents. And actually, I was really struck reading the book by the fact that any 3 of these probably could have done it. They really were that great a talent, and you always assume, looking back through history, that things went the way they did only because of Lincoln, and there's probably a lot of truth to that. But one of the things I really was struck by, reading the beginning of that book, is how able these 3 guys really were. William Seward, Edwin Bates, and Salmon Chase. Each thought themselves far more able and far more deserving of the presidency than Lincoln. They were, as Doris Kearns Goodwin makes clear, his rivals. Nevertheless, Lincoln recognized their talents and recognized that bringing them into the government would be good for the country and help them preserve the Union. He placed Seward at State, Bates as Attorney General, and Chase at Treasury. Doing so, he united the Republican Party, sections of the country, and had able individuals in key slots. He then placed a Democrat, Edwin Stanton, at the head of the War Department. He knew that each of the 4 saw himself as smarter and more able than he, and that, at least at the beginning, each would be happy to throw him overboard in a minute if they thought they could emerge on top. Seward, quite literally, assumed that Lincoln would be a figurehead and that he would be the real president in his position in state. Lincoln brought them in and was simultaneously able to assert his control and show them respect. He quickly put Seward in his place, but also took some of his advice about language for the first inaugural. He consulted the cabinet and listened to them. He gave them room to do their jobs. In the end, all but Chase recognized Lincoln's integrity, brilliance, and leadership abilities, and all but Chase grew to love and respect him. Lincoln tolerated Chase for 3 years because, in fact, Chase did a fabulous job with the Treasury, even as he put knives in Lincoln's back. As we shall see, Lincoln cared about only one thing: winning the war and preserving the Union. He was willing to bear personal disloyalty so close to him if it helped satisfy the objective. He also had enough self-confidence to surround himself with people who were both political and intellectual rivals. Putting together this cabinet was one of Lincoln's most critical decisions early on, and it speaks volumes about what it means to be a successful leader. I want to talk about something that's a little more obscure, the decision by Lincoln to resupply Fort Pickens and Sumter early, before the war actually started, and what that means and what that says about Lincoln. First, a little background. The campaign of 1860 was a battle between those favoring the expansion of slavery into the territories and those in favor of containing slavery in the states where it was already established. Stephen Douglas, the Democrat, ran on a platform of popular sovereignty, whereby each territory would vote and decide whether to allow or ban slavery. Lincoln ran on a platform of containment, while being careful to make clear that he was not in favor of abolition. Douglas knew that popular sovereignty would result in slavery spreading into much of the West, but John Breckinridge, a favorite son of the South, thought Douglas too wishy-washy and ran an openly pro-slavery platform. Not surprisingly, Breckinridge and Douglas split the pro-slavery vote, and Lincoln was elected with a plurality. Also not surprisingly, pro-slavery forces went nuts over Lincoln's election because they believed he was a secret abolitionist and that containment of slavery spelled its ultimate doom. The movement to secede from the Union began. As we know, a big mistake. Had the South not seceded, Lincoln would have contained slavery, but would likely have made no overt movement toward abolition. Lincoln took office on March 4th, 1861. By that point, 7 states, including South Carolina, had seceded. There was still some hope that the crisis could be calmed short of bloodshed. Lincoln had made clear in his inaugural address that he would hold all federal interests, including forts, in seceding states, but he had no interest in provoking a confrontation. Unfortunately, supplies were running low at Fort Pickens off the coast of Pensacola, Florida, and Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln had to decide whether to abandon the forts or send fresh supplies. He decided to resupply both Fort Pickens and Fort Sumter. Pickens was the easier, was resupplied and secured first. The result was the Confederate forces firing on Fort Sumter on April 11, 1861, before it could be resupplied. Why did he do it? First, Lincoln was never going to acquiesce to secession. Second, he said he was going to hold federal property. Third, failure to do so, and this is maybe most importantly, failure to do so would tacitly recognize both the legitimacy of the Confederacy and the right of the Confederacy to seize federal property within its borders. Yet if he reinforced, it might become harder to reach a settlement, bringing the wayward states back into the Union before blood was spilled. And this was still perceived as being a real possibility. And so this wasn't, although this decision doesn't get a lot of attention, it's a momentous decision at that point in history. He had to make a choice. In the end, despite most advice being to abandon the forts, and knowing that even if resupplied, Fort Sumter could not be held for long if attacked, Lincoln decided to resupply. He knew one thing at this point: the Union must be preserved. If he successfully resupplies Pickens and Sumter, he makes his point about Union supremacy. If he fails to resupply, he is tacitly recognizing the notion of state supremacy, and he starts down a slippery slope. In the end, he wins either way. This is how smart Lincoln is. He wins either way. If he successfully resupplies, the point is made, federal supremacy is made clear. If, in response to resupply, the South attacks, they play into his hands by firing the first shots and taking responsibility for starting the war, and they solidify Northern opinion. This decision is perhaps mostly about Lincoln's ability to think clearly and make a decision. His predecessor, James Buchanan, had been paralyzed for fear of provoking the South, and precious months were lost prior to Lincoln taking office. It's almost a certainty that Buchanan would have just let the forts go without resupply. Lincoln acted decisively, and by making the South start the war, strengthened his hand, in some ways as much as the attack on Pearl Harbor did Roosevelt's 80 years later. We'll talk for a second about Lincoln first enduring and then firing George McClellan, and what that says about Lincoln. These things begin to come together. Lincoln's relationship with General McClellan is emblematic of his ability to focus on a singular objective, not unlike his team of rivals. Following the disaster at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, Lincoln sent for General McClellan, who had actually won a couple of skirmishes in the West. The Union Army was demoralized and disorganized. McClellan was an organizational genius, and over the course of the next 10 months, he drilled, organized, and supplied the Army of the Potomac. The Army loved him, which of course he encouraged. He put together a magnificent fighting force, but as we all know, and much to Lincoln's dismay, he refused to use it, saying his men were not ready and that he was making plans. In the meantime, as Lincoln exhibited great patience, McClellan's arrogance grew. He believed he was indispensable to the Army and thus to the country. I've read several letters to his wife, for instance, making this clear. By contrast, Lincoln wanted to crush the enemy early and urged McClellan to attack at Manassas. McClellan favored a much more complex plan to sail down the Potomac to Yorktown and march up the peninsula to capture Richmond. Lincoln was exasperated. He knew that every day the army sat idle, the South was getting stronger. Lincoln visited McClellan almost daily to urge action. McClellan did not respect Lincoln, had little use for his military advice, and thought he alone would save the Union. In letters to his wife, he also wondered whether it would be necessary for him to dislodge civilian authority and assume command for the good of the country. Truman had his megalomaniac in MacArthur. Lincoln had his in McClellan. One incident is telling of Lincoln's single-minded focus on winning the war and preserving the Union. In early 1862, Lincoln, bringing along his son Tad, was at McClellan's headquarters waiting for him to return. When McClellan arrived and was informed that the president was waiting for him, he went upstairs, took off his boots, and lay down in his bed. Lincoln, after a period of time, Lincoln simply said to Tad, "Let's go home." Lincoln obviously knew exactly what McClellan was saying to him. He was more important than the president, and he was above reproach. Lincoln ate it. He believed at that moment he needed McClellan, and he probably did. Lincoln put aside his ego and kept his eye on the bigger objective. McClellan mistook this for weakness. Big mistake. Less than a year later, when Lincoln decided McClellan was a liability, he fired him. Having been transferred in the Peninsula Campaign, despite outnumbering the Confederates 2-1, and after having fought only to a draw at Antietam, and then having failed to pursue Lee as he retreated, Lincoln had had enough and fired McClellan. This is a momentous decision, and again, we look at it with the benefit of hindsight, and it seems obvious and not a huge deal. In fact, it was dangerous for Lincoln to do so. The Army loved McClellan, and he was politically dangerous. MacArthur's megalomania, by contrast, actually destroyed Truman's presidency, and Lincoln ran the same risk, but he did it anyway. But once again, Lincoln did what he needed to do. He knew his objective and stuck with McClellan when it furthered the objective, and sacked him when it hindered the objective. Suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. In April 1861, as Sumter was fired on and war broke out, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. The writ allows one imprisoned to appear before a judge and, if his or her imprisonment is found to be illegal, to be freed immediately. It's a cherished right indirectly embedded in our Constitution. It is also not clear who has the right to suspend the writ in cases of rebellion and when the public safety requires it. The suspension language is found in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. Article 1 delineates the power of Congress, suggesting that the writ can only be suspended by an act of Congress, but Lincoln did it. Lincoln was a lawyer who believed deeply in the rule of law, and yet he acted unilaterally and ultimately ignored a Supreme Court decision to the contrary. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Why did he do so? First, remember the context, and I think this is critical. Armed insurrection on American soil. Lincoln had a rebellion to put down. His singular goal was to preserve the Union. Chaos ruled. This was early. Chaos ruled, as it was not clear which states would stay loyal and which would attempt secession. Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky were in play. The stakes were high and the danger was great. Lincoln, quite literally, could countenance no internal dissent. Here's what set the suspension in motion. In April 1861, just as Fort Sumter is fired on, a Marylander, John Merryman, was actively speaking out against the Union and in favor of having Maryland secede, to the point of helping raise forces for the Confederacy. Lincoln knew that to lose Maryland was to lose the war. In May, Merryman was arrested and charged with treason. Merryman's lawyer sought a writ of habeas corpus. Chief Justice Taney, himself a Marylander, granted the writ and ordered the military to produce Merryman in front of the court. Lincoln and the military refused. Taney declared Lincoln's suspension of the writ unconstitutional. Lincoln ignored the ruling and left Merryman jailed. Lincoln ultimately held Maryland by During the war, over 14,000 were detained, denied access to the courts as a result of Lincoln's suspension of the writ. Most were from the border states and were involved in evading the draft, trading with the enemy, blockade running, or speaking against the Union. But it's also true that some were doing no more than voicing their displeasure with Lincoln or some aspect of federal policy. It's the danger of suspending the writ. Lincoln was roundly criticized for suspension of the writ, and some today see it as a blot on his record. There is no question, on the one hand, that Lincoln understood the gravity of the suspension of the writ, and no doubt he knew it was a dangerous precedent to set. In fact, there were abuses, and some of the criticism is legitimate. And we have paid a price for it, as Lincoln's precedent has been cited as justification for others to ignore the rule of law in circumstances far less dire. Woodrow Wilson using it to silence dissent during World War I is a case in point. But listen to what Lincoln said in response to critics on July 4, 1861. Are all the laws, lest one, to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? Lincoln meant it. He had a deep respect for the Constitution and the rule of law. He understood the gravity of his actions, which makes the fact he did it all the more powerful. In the wrong hands, his language about preserving all the laws but one has the potential to be dangerously self-serving. Under the circumstances, it is consistent with Lincoln, once again, knowing his one objective, winning the war and preserving the Union, lest his equation be proven right. The Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln hated slavery. He recognized it for the evil it was. It is what drew him back into politics in the 1850s after having been out of politics for nearly 10 years. Yet, he believed that even if he wanted to abolish the institution, he did not have the constitutional authority to do so. He took seriously his obligation to uphold the Constitution. And he certainly understood that this question was not the same as making a decision to suspend the writ of habeas corpus because of armed insurrection on American soil. He made his respect for the Constitution clear during the 1858 campaign for the Senate and during the 1860 campaign for the presidency. Lincoln believed that containment of slavery was constitutional, as is made brilliantly laid out incidentally in the Cooper Union speech, while abolition in currently slaveholding states was not. He believed that containment would be a huge victory if he was able to achieve that during his presidency, and that's the reason he ran, would be a huge victory. And if he were able to accomplish that goal during his presidency, he would have done something important. Yet, many in the abolitionist movement, Horace Greeley and Frederick Douglass come to mind, expected Lincoln, once elected, to act quickly to abolish slavery, and were highly agitated and biting in their criticism when he did not do so soon after taking office. Lincoln had to thread the needle. As war broke out, there is no doubt Lincoln understood immediately the ultimate opportunity he had. After all, the war was about nothing but slavery. First, even if Lincoln had been inclined to move quickly, he had a subtle problem. For the first year of the conflict, Lincoln refused to dignify the existence of the Confederacy by saying we were at war. Rather, it was a police action to put down a rebellion. Witness the language in all the recruiting posters that we've all seen. It was about putting down the rebellion. As such, his powers as commander-in-chief were not exactly at his disposal. Chief Justice Taney, author of both the Dred Scott decision and Ex parte Maryland, was hostile. It was not until well into 1862 that the language of Lincoln, his cabinet, and his generals began to shift to war language, which led to Lincoln having significantly expanded war powers. This is important. If he had moved too quickly to issue the proclamation, as if it were a war power, it would almost certainly have been struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. But Lincoln was too smart for that, despite the critics. Secondly, he knew that most in the North supported the war effort at that point only for the purpose of preserving the Union. They were not willing to fight and die to abolish slavery. He knew that if the war was perceived as being about the abolition of slavery at that point, it would actually undermine morale and overall remember that the pro-Union North was still deeply racist. In fact, one of the reasons Northerners did not want slavery in the territories was simply because they did not want blacks in the territories. There were very few truly clean hands. Nevertheless, the agitation continued. The way this unfolded shows Lincoln at the height of his genius. I have no doubt that Lincoln wanted from the start to free the slaves. But as discussed earlier, he believed he lacked the authority to do so, and he knew that if he moved too soon, he would actually ensure they remained in bondage, because he would lose the war for lack of support. The South would successfully form a slave-holding government, and those in bondage would remain so forever, at least that's his perception. Lincoln would be finished as president, the northern states would continue slavery, the northern border states would continue slavery, and perhaps slavery would actually spread into the territories. Here's one of the most controversial things Lincoln ever said, in August of 1862. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I believe whatever I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I believe doing more will help the cause. Lincoln was president. Job one was to save the Union. Without that, everything else is academic. But if you think carefully about what Lincoln was really saying there, he was actually laying the groundwork for freeing the slaves as a matter of military exigency. Because in the end, he was establishing the dynamic. Were he to free the slaves, he would be doing so for militarily exigent reasons, and the public would accept it as such. So the above language, this is just brilliant, I think, which sounds so callous, was actually a brilliantly laid foundation for doing what he really wanted to do. Even as every word he uttered was completely true, Lincoln, the smart politician, brought the country along. He fought off the extremists on both sides and successfully elevated the war effort to higher moral ground than just simply saving the Union.
Could you speak up, please?
Yes. He fought off the extremists on both sides and successfully elevated the war effort to higher moral ground than simply saving the Union. Some revisionist historians have taken Lincoln's words literally and out of context and said that Lincoln really didn't care about freeing the slaves. It is true that Lincoln was a product of his age and thought African Americans generally of inferior intelligence. His reputation in the African American community has declined over time, as some have come to believe he was racist, and in fact freed the slaves only because he had to as a militarily expedient strategy. This is nonsense. He waited for the right moment. He needed his legal footing as commander-in-chief, and he needed at least a nominal Union victory before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, so that he would have both the legal and political strength to weather the storm. Once issued, he then brought the country along over the course of the following 2 years to the point that within the next few years we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, abolishing slavery, guaranteeing citizenship, repeal of the 3/5 compromise, due process, equal protection, and forbidding the use of race as a qualification for voting. This is a stunning achievement that had to do with much more than military exigency. All of this shows us Lincoln's clearest, smartest thinking. He read the public, and when the time was right, he advanced the ball and accomplished more than he ever could have accomplished had he not had the strength of character to endure the censure of radical Republicans, even though they were right, on one level. Frederick Douglass figured it out and came to revere Lincoln as the savior he was. On a substantive level, Lincoln remained true to his singular objective of preserving the Union. On a strategic level, he brilliantly set up for a desired policy objective. These 5 decisions demonstrate Lincoln's ability to stay focused through the din on his singular objective of winning the war and preserving the Union, and his sense of timing that allowed him to expand the moral underpinnings of the war and thus put us on the path to living up to the ideals of Jefferson and Madison. He put his pride aside, saying at one point that he would be happy to hold McClellan's horse if he would just fight. In the long run, all the insults and slights directed his way were and remain irrelevant, except to the extent his ability to brush them off underscores his greatness. By winning the war and saving the Union, he was able to free the slaves, set up passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. This stunning accomplishment secures his place in history. His defining character trait was an ability to think clearly, to be, on the one hand, a smart politician, on the other, always honest. He was guided by reason, a sense of purpose, facts, and a moral compass. He was able to understand and process criticism without being controlled by it. He knew who he was, and he knew what mattered and what did not matter. In the end, all revisionist history aside, his greatest assets were his razor-sharp intellect, his unwavering clarity of purpose, and the fact that, as trite as it is, he was in fact Honest Abe. Questions? Comments? Incidentally, I'm going to work on putting together some talks and speaking about Abraham and Robert around the country, actually, is when the opportunities present itself. So I would welcome any comments, any thoughts. Yes?
You had indicated that if the 3 members that he put in the cabinet had in fact become president instead of him, had been nominated and elected, that they could have done the job. You really think that that's the case?
I think, for instance, take Seward.
Yeah.
I think if Seward had been elected president, he would have, relatively speaking, followed the policies Lincoln did. Whether his ego would have gotten in the way, and whether it would have led him to make some bad decisions, I'm not sure, but he was a person of true substance, and I believe he believed as strongly as Lincoln in preserving the Union, and I do believe he would have done it. Lincoln is great for a whole number of reasons. Seward, my guess is, would not have maybe gone down as great a president as Lincoln, but I think he would have done the job. I think the same is true of Bates, and I'm not as sure about Chase, because he had such ego problems, they probably would have gotten him away. You were next, actually. We'll do it.
Well, I mean, it was a great thing freeing the slaves, but it was only a job half done. Freedom isn't worth much unless you have equality.
That's right.
And he didn't have, equality didn't come, we all know that didn't come. It started to come 100 years later, it's still coming. In a lot of ways, the slaves were worse off after they were freed than they were before they were freed. They had nothing, no place to go, no place to live, and that's another whole story. But the point is, when we think so much about freedom, but freedom is only one element, and an element of 4. And if the other elements aren't put in with it, it's kind of like having one good tire on your car and 3 more bad ones. You're probably not going down the road too far, you're still going to be sitting in the ditch.
Nobody can argue with that. Nobody would. The compromise of 1876, which elected Harrison over Tilden, ended Reconstruction. We didn't get back to it until the 60s. And that's really what happened. So I agree with you entirely. Yes, or somebody here.
You go first, please.
Okay.
It's been said that Lincoln would not have been able to do what he did without Douglas. Is that your opinion?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Never thought about that.
Yeah.
The question was, would Lincoln have been able to do what he did without Douglas?
Which Douglas?
No, I think she's talking about Stephen Douglas.
Frederick Douglass. That was the reference I made. Without Frederick Douglass, we wouldn't be able to accommodate the
I don't know. I thought you were talking about Stephen Douglas, because that would have been an interesting question as well.
Maybe they meant Stephen Douglas.
Because I think Stephen Douglas was a smart guy, and he made his arguments as well as they could be made. And it made Lincoln be on his best game. And when Lincoln ran against Douglas in 1858, Lincoln clearly elevated his game, and it set him up for the election of 1860, with the Cooper Union speech in particular being one of the most brilliant speeches ever given.
Yep.
Okay, you can go first, Bob. I'm sorry, I forgot about Steve, I'm sorry. Actually, Steve was next.
Okay. Well, you know, when I was reading the Team of Rivals book, what really impressed me, what really struck me, is that the Emancipation Proclamation was really, in many ways, you had the reference of Truman, was really Lincoln's atomic bomb. Because what the Emancipation Proclamation did is it removed the slaves from the Confederate battle lines and moved them to the Union battle lines. The slaves were doing all the earthworks, were doing all the tough work, and suddenly the Confederates lost military power.
Well, that was the military exigency,
Right.
portion of it. And
Method.
beyond that, changing the morality, the moral underpinnings for what we were fighting for was, in the long run, is even more important than that. But it was the military exigency that allowed him to do it. Bob.
I was wondering if the man that painted the oil painting, Alonzo Chapel, that hung in where you go in Bennington Museum, you're right inside on the wall, did a steel engraving of Abraham Lincoln, and it looks like he's up in the attic of the Capitol, and he's sitting in a chair, and he's looking at a bust on George Washington, and he's holding the U.S. Constitution book in his hands, and I think he looked, and on the floor is a newspaper where 2 or 3 of the southern states has succeeded, and he's got his feet on the paper, and the paper is ripped up. Saving the Union and thinking of what to do.
Neil, you were.
I'm sorry, thank you. Reference made often about the
Cooper Union.
Union speech. But understanding the press, to some small degree, at the time, New York City voted virulently against Lincoln. Their commercial interests were very concerning to them, with good reason. They shipped the cotton, they insured the ships, there was all the mercantile reasons, and they didn't vote for Lincoln. I do believe the state of New York voted for Lincoln in total. Why the importance of the Cooper Union speech in terms of its national, the spread, the height?
Now, when I answer this, my source for all of this is, of course, Harold Holzer and his brilliant book, Lincoln and Cooper Union.
Right.
It got him national attention. Lincoln was invited to two reasons. One of them is that speech got him national attention because it was covered. The Times covered it, and it got out. The other thing that he did, and I never had realized this until I read the book, Harold's book, is that he didn't give that speech once. He gave it 15 or 20 times, all around New England. And that's really what did it. The one speech alone wouldn't have done it. That was critical, and it got him started, and it got national attention. But he was in New Hampshire, he was in Massachusetts, he was in Connecticut, he was in Rhode Island. He gave that speech time after time after time, and it really raised his reputation. It is, I I was reading it actually right before I came down here again. For a lawyerly, there's a lot of Lincoln speeches are brilliant for different reasons. This one is brilliant, it's just lawyerly brilliance as he demolishes Douglas.
When we were talking about could the other cabinet members have done an equal job, I think there's a piece of it that has to do with the power of speaking and words. You've talked about that before. The Lincoln birthday speech was on that last year as well.
Yeah.
And you might have exactly the same aim, but the power of a leader to speak in such a way, in sincerity and in clarity, and with lawyerly logic, and to inspire people to follow along because they believe he's telling the truth and he's telling a necessary truth. I think I see a character in
I agree with you
Abraham
entirely.
Lincoln that I don't know if the others do.
That's very well stated. I hope everybody heard that. I think you're absolutely right. And on a workmanlike level, Seward, for instance, I think would have gotten the job done, but he would not have been what Lincoln was for the reasons you're talking about.
Just one comment on that. If you look back and say, well, Seward became president, he might not have succeeded because he didn't have the ability to speak out, in which case we wouldn't have the United States of America, we would have two countries. So I think you still have to go back and pinpoint Lincoln. He was the right man at the right time.
I'll go for that too. I'm a real Lincoln loyalist in it for my life. No continence, no dissent. So,
What do you think would have happened if he hadn't been assassinated? What do you think?
oh,
Would he have-
And living in Manchester, Vermont.
you know, that's such an interesting, the question was, if Lincoln had not been assassinated, would he in the end have had the stature that he has now? That's such an interesting question. I have no idea. I mean, there is for stature and for posterity on that level alone. The assassination probably raised it. And what would have happened if he'd gone through those 3 years and ended up fighting with the Republican majority in Congress, trying to keep one branch of the party from excesses, and what might have happened, might he have been diminished by that? I don't know. I really, it's impossible to tell, but it's a great question. But that, somebody's, I mean, that's a topic for books. Yeah.
Lincoln said, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
I mean, I look at that, I mean, it's in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, but the leader who is not afraid to surround him or herself with people who are their intellectual equals or even smarter, those are the successful leaders. The ones who are afraid to do that are not successful. We're early, I hate being so short.
Seth, I have two quick comments. The first comment is for everybody to listen to. I'd like to thank Seth for organizing these. Every time we come to one of these, we learn so much more, and we're all continuous learners, and we just learn so much, and I learned so much tonight from you. And one of the other components of that is to try to share some things with other people. And I have one quick comment. It's not critical, but you mentioned Breckinridge as one of his Democratic opponents, and he became some figure that was popular in a lot of the places out west. In the territory of Colorado, they named Breckinridge after him. But when he became and joined with the South, they got so upset because they wanted to be a free state, they changed the spelling. And that's why Breckinridge, you probably look, has an I, Breckinridge, but Breckinridge, Colorado has an E. And they changed it because they didn't want anything to do with it.
Yes.
Well, I like your opinion, I guess, of how much of a role, influence, whatever else, did Vermont play in the Civil War?
Oh, that's its own book, and that's a Howard Coffin question, but, a new rule. I mean, Vermont had the highest casualty rate of any percentage of any state in the Union. Vermont was in key places at key times. Insurance back, Pickens charge is one example. For its size, Vermont played a real role. With the north of one without Vermont, yeah, probably.
Plus the
We
Morgan
certainly
horse.
did. Yeah, plus the Morgan horse, yeah.
Had the first two regiments of sharpshooters. And President Abraham Lincoln asked to go and see them. They went, where did they go? New York, and then they went down to Washington DC. And they were shooting that day, and President Lincoln, went there with McClellan, and they both shot guns that day, and President Abraham Lincoln, I've got the book, and it tells whose rifle he shot. At that time, the sharpshooter regiments brought their own target rifles from home.
What's the book?
All right,
What's the book he referenced?
I don't know.
Oh.
What book were you referencing, Bob? What book were you referencing?
I've got the book that I got recently. It tells about General Y.W. Ripley, the general from Rutland, Vermont, and his brother was the captain. They have their uniforms used to in the showcase in Bennington Museum. And it tells, he was General, it's W.Y.W. Ripley from Rutland. He was in charge of those two Vermont sharpshooting regiments in the Civil War, and he got shot, and his men had to leave him against a tree, and his men thought so much of him, they went back there and rescued him and brought him out of there. And his horse, he got shot in the knee, and his horse got shot. And the horse wouldn't fall down and die until General Ripley fell off from the horse, and then his horse laid down and died.
Okay, thanks, everybody.